The most expensive 3 words in Atlantic City history weren't spoken in a courtroom or a boardroom. They were whispered across a casino floor on a humid August night in 1966 when the smell of salt air mixed with cigarette smoke and the desperation of men who had bet everything on the wrong horse. Dean Martin didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He simply looked across the gaudy expanse of the Golden Sands Casino, fixed his half-lidded eyes on Vincent, Vinny the Fish Torrino, and spoke 3 words that would destroy a criminal empire worth $50 million. Call Frank, now. Within 30 minutes, Vinny Torrino would be begging for his life. Within 6 hours, his casino would be empty. Within a week, he would be fleeing Atlantic City in the trunk of a Buick, leaving behind an empire built on blood money and protected by corruption that had taken him 20 years to construct. Because when Dean Martin called in a favor from Frank Sinatra, he wasn't just asking for help. He was unleashing the most dangerous network of loyalty, power, and ruthless justice that the entertainment world had ever known. The Golden Sands Casino stood on Atlantic City's boardwalk like a monument to American greed. Its neon facade promised dreams but delivered nightmares to anyone foolish enough to believe that the house didn't always win. Inside, the air was thick with the musk of desperation and the artificial optimism that casinos manufacture to separate fools from their money. Slot machines rang their siren songs, roulette wheels spun like prayer wheels for the financially damned, and over it all presided Vincent Torrino, a man who had built his kingdom on the bones of those who had trusted him. Vinny wasn't just a casino owner. He was a predator who had perfected the art of destroying lives with a smile. His operation was simple, but devastatingly effective. Lure high-profile entertainers to his casino with promises of easy money and royal treatment, then use their gambling debts as leverage to control their careers. Musicians who owed Vinny money found their bookings mysteriously canceled. Comedians who crossed him discovered that their television appearances disappeared. Singers who tried to leave Atlantic City without paying their debts often found themselves with broken fingers that made playing instruments difficult. It was a perfect racket, protected by corrupt police and greedy politicians who took their cut of the profits in exchange for looking the other way. Vinny Torrino had been untouchable for 2 decades, a cancer that had metastasized through the entertainment industry until everyone simply accepted that Atlantic City belonged to the fish, and the fish answered to no one. Until the night Dean Martin walked into the Golden Sands and discovered that even the king of cool had limits to what he would tolerate. The trouble had started 3 weeks earlier in Las Vegas, when a young comedian named Bobby Castellano had approached Dean after a show at the Sands. Bobby was 24 years old, talented enough to make Dean laugh, and stupid enough to believe that gambling was a way to get rich quick. He had heard about Vinny Torrino's operation in Atlantic City, about the high-stakes games and the celebrity treatment, and he wanted Dean's advice about whether it was worth the risk. Dean had given Bobby the same advice he gave every young entertainer who asked about gambling. Don't. The house always wins. The only way to beat a casino is to own one. But Bobby was young and hungry and convinced that his luck was different from everyone else's. He thanked Dean for the advice and promptly ignored it. 2 weeks later, Bobby was dead. Not literally, but professionally. His debt to Vinny Torrino had grown from $5,000 to $50,000 through the mysterious mathematics of casino bookkeeping. When Bobby couldn't pay, Vinny had used his connections to destroy the young comedian's career. Bookings were canceled, agents stopped returning calls, club owners who had loved Bobby's act suddenly found reasons not to hire him. Within a week, Bobby Castellano had gone from a rising star to a broken man sleeping on friends' couches and considering whether a construction job in his hometown was preferable to the slow death of a ruined entertainment career. That's when he made the call that would change everything. Bobby called Dean Martin not because he expected help, but because he needed someone to know what had happened. He needed someone to understand that Vinny Torrino wasn't just taking money from entertainers, he was stealing their dreams, their futures, their ability to create joy in a world that needed all the laughter it could get. Dean listened to Bobby's story with the patience of a man who had heard similar tales too many times. The details were always different, but the pattern was always the same. Young talent meets organized crime, loses more than money, disappears into the vast anonymity of broken dreams. Most of the time, Dean offered sympathy, some financial help, and practical advice about finding legitimate work outside the entertainment industry. But this time was different. This time, Vinny Torrino had made a crucial mistake. He had targeted someone under Dean Martin's protection, someone who had come to Dean for advice and been ignored. In Dean's personal code of ethics, that made Vinny's actions a direct challenge to his authority, his judgment, and his ability to protect the people who trusted him. Dean made 2 phone calls that afternoon. The first was to his lawyer, who confirmed what Dean already suspected. Vinny Torrino's operation was protected by enough corrupt officials that legal action would be slow, expensive, and probably futile. The second call was to his travel agent, who booked Dean on the next flight to Atlantic City. Dean Martin didn't make impulsive decisions. Every move he made was calculated, every word carefully chosen for maximum effect. But by the time his plane touched down at Atlantic City Airport, Dean had already decided that Vinny Torrino's reign of terror was going to end, even if Dean had to destroy the man personally. The Golden Sands Casino on that humid August night was packed with the usual collection of dreamers, degenerates, and predators that populated Atlantic City's gaming floors. Dean entered through the main entrance like a gunslinger, walking into a saloon in a Western movie. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that cost more than most people's cars. His hair was perfect, and his expression was the kind of calm that made smart people nervous. Vinny Torrino spotted Dean immediately. Despite his reputation for brutality, Vinny was a student of popular culture who understood the value of celebrity endorsements. Having Dean Martin seen gambling at the Golden Sands would be worth millions in free publicity. Vinny hurried across the casino floor, his arms spread wide in a gesture of false hospitality. "Dean Martin," Vinny boomed, his voice carrying the artificial enthusiasm of a used car salesman closing a deal. "What an honor. What brings the king of cool to Atlantic City?" Dean removed his sunglasses and looked Vinny up and down like he was inspecting a particularly unappetizing piece of meat. "I heard you got games here." "The best games on the East Coast," Vinny replied, his chest swelling with pride. "High stakes, no limits, and we treat our special guests like royalty. Come on, let me show you around." What followed was a tour through Vinny's kingdom of greed. The main casino floor was impressive enough, with its imported marble and crystal chandeliers, but Vinny was eager to show off the private rooms where the real action happened. These were the chambers where millionaires lost fortunes, and where young entertainers signed away their futures for the temporary thrill of feeling important. Dean played his role perfectly. He admired the decor, complimented the service, and allowed himself to be introduced to the other high rollers, as if he were genuinely impressed by Vinny's operation. He even sat down at a blackjack table and played a few hands, losing deliberately to make Vinny feel like he was in control. But Dean was studying everything: the security cameras, the dealers who were obviously cheating, the collection of broken dreams that littered Vinny's empire like debris after a hurricane. Most importantly, he was studying Vinny himself, looking for weaknesses, pressure points, the psychological buttons that could be pushed to bring the house of cards tumbling down. The opportunity came during dinner in Vinny's private dining room, where the casino owner held court like a medieval king surrounded by his vassals. The room was decorated with gaudy gold fixtures and oil paintings of questionable taste. The food was expensive, but poorly prepared. The wine was overpriced and underaged. Everything about the experience screamed of new money trying to buy class and failing miserably. Vinny regaled his guests with stories of his conquests: the politicians he had bought, the entertainers he had crushed, the competitors he had driven out of business. He spoke about Bobby Castellano with particular relish, describing how he had enjoyed watching the young comedian's career die slowly, like a flower wilting in the sun. "That kid thought he was smart," Vinny laughed, his voice thick with wine and satisfaction. "He thought he could come to my casino, take my money, and walk away clean. I showed him different. I showed him that nobody, and I mean nobody, plays Vincent Torrino for a fool." Dean continued eating his overcooked steak, as if he hadn't heard anything unusual. But behind his calm exterior, something cold and dangerous was crystallizing. Vinny Torrino hadn't just destroyed Bobby Castellano's career, he had enjoyed it. He had taken pleasure in crushing a young man's dreams, and he was proud enough of his cruelty to brag about it to a room full of witnesses. "You seem proud of that," Dean observed quietly, his voice carrying just enough edge to make everyone at the table pay attention. "Damn right I'm proud," Vinny replied, his face flushed with wine and arrogance. "This business is about respect. You don't get respect by being soft. You get respect by showing people what happens when they try to make you look stupid." Dean nodded thoughtfully and returned his attention to his meal. But the other guests at the table were beginning to sense that something had shifted in the atmosphere. The conversation became more forced, the laughter more nervous. Even Vinny seemed to realize that his bragging might have gone too far. After dinner, Vinny insisted on showing Dean the casino's crown jewel, a private poker room where the minimum bet was $10,000 and the maximum was limited only by a player's courage and bank account. The room was designed to look like a gentleman's club from the 1920s, with leather chairs, dark wood paneling, and oil paintings of hunting scenes. It was here that Vinny had destroyed the careers of dozens of entertainers, and he was clearly hoping to add Dean Martin to his collection of trophies. Dean agreed to play a few hands, but only after establishing the stakes. "I don't play for pocket change," Dean said, his voice casual but his meaning clear. "If we're going to do this, let's make it interesting." Vinny's eyes lit up with greed. In his experience, celebrities were terrible poker players who relied on their charm and fame to compensate for their lack of skill. He was convinced that Dean Martin would be no different, and the prospect of taking the King of Cool for hundreds of thousands of dollars was too tempting to resist. The game that followed was a master class in psychological warfare. Dean played with the patience of a professional and the instincts of a street hustler. He won some hands and lost others, always keeping the action close enough to maintain Vinny's interest without arousing suspicion. But more importantly, he was gathering information, learning how Vinny thought, how he reacted under pressure, what buttons could be pushed to make him lose control. The breakthrough came during the fifth hand, when Dean caught Vinny cheating. It was subtle, a marked card, a dealer's signal that most players would never notice, but Dean had learned to read such signs during his days dealing blackjack in illegal gambling dens. He didn't call out the cheating immediately. Instead, he waited, watching for the perfect moment to spring his trap. That moment came when the stakes had risen to $250,000, and Vinny was convinced he was about to win the biggest pot of his career. Dean had been playing conservatively all night, but suddenly he began raising aggressively, pushing the bet higher and higher until even Vinny began to sweat. "Getting a little rich for your blood, Dean?" Vinny taunted, trying to regain his psychological advantage. "Maybe you should stick to singing and leave the gambling to people who understand the game." Dean smiled his trademark sleepy smile and pushed another stack of chips into the center of the table. "Oh, I understand the game just fine, Vinny. The question is whether you understand what game we're really playing." The final hand was dealt. Vinny looked at his cards and felt his heart rate spike. He had a straight flush, a virtually unbeatable hand that came along once in a lifetime. Even if Dean had been dealt 4 aces, Vinny would still win. The pot had grown to over $1 million, enough money to make even a millionaire's hands shake with anticipation. Dean looked at his cards without expression, then slowly pushed his entire remaining stack of chips into the center of the table. "All in," he said quietly. Vinny didn't hesitate. With a straight flush in his hand, he couldn't lose. He called the bet and laid down his cards with a triumphant grin. "Read 'em, and weep," he said, spreading the cards across the green felt. "Straight flush, jack high." Dean nodded appreciatively. "That's a hell of a hand, Vinny. Almost impossible to beat." He paused, letting the tension build. "Almost." Dean laid down his cards one by one. Royal flush, the best possible hand in poker, the hand that every player dreams of holding just once in their lifetime. The room fell silent except for the whisper of air conditioning and the distant sound of slot machines from the main casino floor. But Dean wasn't finished. "Of course," he said, picking up one of Vinny's discarded cards and examining it closely. "It's a lot easier to get a good hand when you're dealing from a marked deck." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Every person in the room understood the implications. If Vinny Torrino had been caught cheating against Dean Martin, it wasn't just a matter of money, it was a matter of reputation, respect, and survival in a world where such things determined whether you lived or died. Vinny's face went pale, then flushed red with anger and fear. "You're calling me a cheat?" he sputtered. "In my own casino? That's a serious accusation, Martin." Dean stood up slowly, his movement fluid and controlled. "It's not an accusation, Vinny. It's a fact. You've been running marked cards all night, using dealers who signal when you need help, and rigging the game in your favor. The only reason I didn't call you out earlier is because I wanted to see just how far you'd go." The security guards in the room began to move closer, their hands moving toward the weapons concealed beneath their jackets. But Dean seemed completely unaware of the danger, or perhaps simply indifferent to it. Here's the thing about cheating, Dean continued, his voice conversational but carrying an undertone of steel. It only works when nobody notices. But I've been noticing everything, Vinny. The marked cards, the crooked dealers, the way you destroyed Bobby Castellano's career when he couldn't pay debts that you inflated through your cheating. Vinny tried to bluster his way out of the confrontation. You can't prove anything, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. And even if you could, who's going to believe you? This is my town, Martin. I own the cops, the judges, the politicians. Your word against mine doesn't mean shit here. That's when Dean Martin smiled. It wasn't the charming smile he wore on stage, or the lazy grin he used to seduce women. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting all night for exactly this moment. You're right, Vinny, Dean said, reaching into his jacket pocket. My word against yours doesn't mean much, but the thing is, I didn't come here alone. Dean pulled out a small recording device, cutting-edge technology for 1966, but still crude enough that it could be hidden in a cigarette pack. The red recording light blinked steadily, indicating that everything that had been said in the private poker room had been captured on tape. Every word you spoke tonight was recorded, Dean said calmly. Your confession about destroying Bobby Castellano, your bragging about owning corrupt officials, your admission that you cheat your customers and destroy anyone who crosses you. It's all on tape, Vinny, every damning word. The color drained from Vinny's face as he realized the magnitude of his situation. The recording wasn't just evidence of cheating, it was proof of racketeering, corruption, and conspiracy. In the wrong hands, that tape could destroy not just Vinny's operation, but the entire network of corruption that protected it. What do you want? Vinny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dean adjusted his tie and straightened his cuffs, taking his time to savor the moment. I want you to understand something very clearly, he said. You made a mistake when you went after Bobby Castellano. You see, Bobby asked me for advice, and I told him to stay away from your casino. When he ignored my advice and you destroyed him, you made it personal. You made it about my judgment, my ability to protect people who trust me. Dean walked closer to Vinny, close enough that the casino owner could smell his expensive cologne and see the absolute certainty in his eyes. So here's what's going to happen, Dean continued. You're going to call Bobby Castellano. You're going to apologize for destroying his career. You're going to pay him compensation, let's say $500,000 for the damage you've done. And you're going to use whatever connections you have to restore his bookings and get his career back on track. Vinny tried to object, but Dean cut him off with a gesture. I'm not finished, Dean said. You're also going to clean up your operation. No more cheating, no more marked cards, no more destroying people's lives because you enjoy the power. You're going to run a legitimate business, or you're not going to run a business at all. And if I refuse? Vinny asked, though he already knew the answer. Dean reached into his other pocket and pulled out a business card. It was simple, white cardstock with just a phone number printed in elegant script. No name, no title, just 10 digits that would change Vinny's life forever. If you refuse, Dean said, placing the card on the poker table, I make one phone call, 3 words to the right person, and your protection disappears. The cops who take your money will suddenly develop honest streaks. The judges who fix your cases will remember their oath of office. The politicians who cover for you will discover that you're a liability they can't afford. Dean paused, letting the implications sink in. But that's not the worst part, Vinny. The worst part is that this tape will find its way to people who don't appreciate being embarrassed. People who don't like discovering that their investment in you was based on lies. People who handle disappointment in very permanent ways. The room was so quiet that everyone could hear Vinny's labored breathing. Sweat was running down his face despite the air conditioning. His hands were shaking as he realized that his empire, everything he had built over 20 years of careful corruption and calculated brutality, could be destroyed by 3 words from Dean Martin. Dean checked his watch, a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and threatening. You have 24 hours to make your decision, he said. Call Bobby Castellano, make this right. Or call that phone number, and try to explain to Frank Sinatra why you thought you could destroy someone under his protection. The mention of Frank Sinatra's name had an electric effect on everyone in the room. Even Vinny's security guards seemed to shrink back, suddenly unwilling to make eye contact with Dean Martin. In the entertainment world of 1966, Frank Sinatra wasn't just a singer. He was the unofficial chairman of a board that included some of the most dangerous men in America. Dean picked up his winnings, over $1 million in chips, and handed them to one of the security guards. "Cash these out and give the money to charity," he said. "I didn't come here to get rich, I came here to deliver a message." As Dean walked toward the door, Vinny called after him with desperate bravado. "You think you scare me, Martin? You think because you know Frank Sinatra, you can waltz into my casino and threaten me?" Dean stopped at the doorway and turned around one last time. The look on his face was not anger or hatred, it was something far more dangerous. It was the calm certainty of a man who held all the cards and knew exactly how the game would end. "I'm not threatening you, Vinny," Dean said quietly. "I'm educating you. You see, you've spent so much time being the most dangerous man in Atlantic City that you forgot there are bigger fish in the ocean. Tonight, you just met one of them." Dean walked out of the Golden Sands Casino at 11:47 p.m., leaving behind a room full of people who understood that they had just witnessed the end of an era. Within an hour, the story of what had happened in the private poker room was spreading through Atlantic City's criminal underground like wildfire. Vinny Torrino had been publicly humiliated by Dean Martin, caught cheating, and given an ultimatum that everyone knew he couldn't refuse. But the real devastation came the next morning, when Vinny made the phone call that would save his life but destroy his empire. He called Bobby Castellano, apologized profusely, and offered him $500,000 in compensation, plus a guarantee that his career would be restored. He also called a press conference to announce that the Golden Sands Casino was implementing new policies to ensure fair play and ethical treatment of all guests. The changes weren't enough to save Vinny's reputation, but they were enough to keep him breathing. The corrupt officials who had protected him began to distance themselves, afraid that association with him would bring unwanted attention from federal investigators. The criminal investors who had bankrolled his operation started looking for ways to remove him without attracting the attention of Frank Sinatra and his associates. Within 6 months, Vincent "Vinny the Fish" Torrino had been forced out of the casino business entirely. His empire was divided among more cautious operators who understood the value of treating entertainers with respect rather than viewing them as prey to be exploited. Atlantic City's entertainment scene became more legitimate, more professional, and infinitely safer for young performers trying to build their careers. Bobby Castellano used his settlement money to finance an independent comedy tour that launched him into national stardom. He never forgot that his career was saved by Dean Martin's intervention, and he spent the rest of his life championing the rights of young entertainers who found themselves in impossible situations. But the most lasting impact of that night wasn't on the casino industry or even on Bobby Castellano's career. It was on the mythology of Dean Martin himself. The story of how the King of Cool had destroyed a criminal empire with 3 words became legend in entertainment circles, a reminder that beneath the relaxed exterior and easy smile was a man who would go to extraordinary lengths to protect those who trusted him. Years later, when asked about the incident during a rare interview, Dean Martin downplayed his role with characteristic modesty. "Vinny was a bully," he said with a shrug. "Bullies only understand one thing: superior force. I just happened to know where to find some." The 3 words, "Call Frank, now," became a code phrase in the entertainment industry, shorthand for the kind of absolute loyalty and terrifying power that the Rat Pack represented at the height of their influence. It was a reminder that in a world where talent could be exploited and dreams could be destroyed, there were still people who would stand up for what was right, even when it meant taking on the most dangerous enemies imaginable. The Golden Sands Casino still stands on the Atlantic City boardwalk, though under different ownership and a different name. Tourists who gamble there today have no idea that they're walking through the scene of one of the most decisive confrontations in entertainment history. But if they listen carefully on quiet nights, when the wind blows in from the Atlantic and the neon lights flicker like dying stars, they might hear the ghost of a conversation that changed everything. 3 words that prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world is knowing exactly who to call when the odds are stacked against you. Dean Martin walked out of that casino carrying more than just his winnings. He carried the knowledge that he had used his power responsibly, that he had protected someone who couldn't protect himself, and that he had sent a message to every predator in the entertainment industry that there were still lines that couldn't be crossed without consequences. The King of Cool had shown that true coolness wasn't about being indifferent to injustice. It was about having the strength to fight it with style, precision, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing that when you need backup, you can call in the cavalry with just 3 words: "Call Frank, now."